Blood stained the knuckles of Bartholomew Jericho as he stared at his reflection in the tarnished mirror of the San Vicente saloon, his eyes hollow and cold as the Wyoming winter of 1882. The man looking back at him wasn't the same bright-eyed cowhand who'd left Tennessee 5 years ago. This man was weathered, hardened, with a soul that had forgotten how to trust anything but the weight of his Colt revolver and the bitter taste of whiskey. The saloon buzzed with the usual evening crowd, miners, cowboys, and the occasional traveler passing through the dusty frontier town. Bart, as most called him, preferred the corner table where he could keep his back to the wall and his eyes on everyone else. He'd learned that lesson the hard way in Dodge City. "Another," he muttered to the barkeep, sliding his empty glass across the worn wooden counter. The man obliged without question, knowing better than to engage Bart in conversation when his face was set like stone. Whiskey had become Bart's closest companion since he'd buried his brother 2 years prior. Thomas had been gunned down by cattle rustlers while they were moving a herd north. Bart had watched him die, cradling his head as blood soaked the prairie grass. He'd hunted down every last man responsible, dispatching frontier justice with cold precision. But vengeance hadn't filled the void left behind. The sound of the saloon doors swinging open barely registered until a hush fell over the room. Bart glanced up from his whiskey, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. But it wasn't trouble that had walked in, at least not the shooting kind. A woman stood in the doorway, dressed in black from head to toe, her face partially obscured by a delicate veil. Even in mourning attire, she carried herself with undeniable dignity. This was Lucinda Stanton, widow of Gerald Stanton, the town's former banker who'd succumbed to pneumonia 3 months prior. Lucinda moved toward the bar with purpose, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. A woman alone in a saloon was unusual enough, but a widow of her standing was downright scandalous. "Mr. Peterson," she addressed the barkeep firmly, "I need to speak with you about my husband's outstanding account." Peterson looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around the room. "Perhaps this isn't the best place, Mrs. Stanton. I've visited your home twice with no success. This seems to be the only place where I can find you reliably," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. Bart watched the exchange with mild interest, noting the way her gloved hands gripped her small purse. She was afraid but determined not to show it. "Your husband borrowed against his future earnings," Peterson said quietly. "With his passing, well, the debt remains. I've reviewed his ledgers. There is no record of such a loan." The widow's voice remained level, but Bart could see the slight tremor in her stance. Peterson's face hardened. "Are you calling me a liar, Mrs. Stanton?" Before she could respond, a man at a nearby table rose, swaying slightly from too much liquor. "Leave the lady alone, Peterson. Everyone knows you've been trying to swindle the widow since Gerald was barely cold." Peterson's hand moved beneath the bar, and Bart knew from experience he kept a shotgun there. The situation was turning ugly fast. "Mrs. Stanton," Bart found himself saying, the words leaving his mouth before he'd fully decided to speak. "I believe your carriage is waiting." All eyes turned to him, including the widow's startled gaze. Bart stood, downing the last of his whiskey before approaching her. "I don't have a," she began. "Yes, you do," he interrupted firmly, offering his arm. It was a clear invitation to exit before things escalated. After a moment's hesitation, Lucinda placed her gloved hand on his proffered arm. Bart guided her toward the door, his other hand casually resting near his holster, a warning to anyone considering intervention. Once outside, the cool evening air swept away some of the saloon's stuffiness. Lucinda withdrew her hand from his arm and turned to face him. "Thank you, Mr. Jericho, Bartholomew Jericho, Mr. Jericho." She tilted her head slightly, studying him with intelligent brown eyes. "While I appreciate your assistance, I had matters to settle with Mr. Peterson." "Peterson's not a man who settles matters fairly with women, especially when money's involved." Bart adjusted his hat, uncomfortable under her direct gaze. Your husband's been gone what, 3 months? 12 weeks, she corrected, a flash of pain crossing her features. Bart nodded. Vultures circle quickest when they smell vulnerability. I am not vulnerable, Mr. Jericho. The widow lifted her chin slightly. I am inconvenienced. Something about her quiet defiance made Bart's mouth twitch toward a smile, an expression so foreign to his face lately that it felt like a muscle strain. Of course, madam. He glanced back at the saloon. Even so, Peterson has friends who won't take kindly to being called out publicly. Might be best if you had someone accompany you next time you need to discuss business. Lucinda considered him for a moment. Are you offering your services, Mr. Jericho? I'm suggesting you find someone less likely to add to your troubles than solve them. Bart touched the brim of his hat in farewell. Evening, Mrs. Stanton. He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. Mr. Jericho, wait. She took a step toward him. You're staying at the boarding house on Pine Street, aren't you? I've seen you coming and going. Bart nodded cautiously. I have a proposition for you. My husband left some affairs in disarray, and I find myself in need of assistance sorting through certain matters. I would compensate you fairly for your time. I'm not a bookkeeper, Mrs. Stanton. No, but you're observant, direct, and clearly not intimidated by men like Peterson. She drew a deep breath. I'll be frank, Mr. Jericho. Since my husband's death, several discrepancies have come to light. Loans with no documentation, property deeds with questionable signatures. I suspect foul play, but as a woman alone. She let the implication hang in the air. Bart studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or deceit. He found only determination and exhaustion. Come by the boarding house tomorrow morning, he said finally. 8 o'clock. We'll discuss it further. Relief softened her features momentarily. Thank you, Mr. Jericho. He watched as she walked away, her black skirts sweeping the dusty street. Something about her reminded him of his mother, that same core of steel beneath a proper exterior. It had been a long time since Bart had allowed himself to be pulled into anyone else's problems. The world had proven itself unworthy of such investment. Yet here he was, agreeing to meet a widow he barely knew, all because she'd faced down a saloon full of men with nothing but her dignity as armor. Bart returned to his room at the boarding house, a sparse space containing little more than a narrow bed, washstand, and trunk for his few possessions. He removed his gun belt, hanging it on the bedpost within easy reach, and sat heavily on the edge of the mattress. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the flask in his vest pocket, a daily ritual born of nightmares and memories. Tonight, however, he paused, staring at his trembling fingers. When had that started? The shaking used to come only after particularly bad dreams about Thomas, but lately it seemed a constant companion. Bart tucked the flask away without drinking. Tomorrow would require a clear head, and he'd already had enough whiskey tonight to ensure sleep, however fitful it might be. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through the thin curtains. Bart rose, splashed cold water on his face, and dressed with care. At precisely 8 o'clock, a soft knock sounded at his door. Lucinda Stanton stood in the hallway, her morning attire as impeccable as the day before, though she'd foregone the veil. Without it, Bart could better see her features, a heart-shaped face with high cheekbones, full lips pressed into a determined line, and those deep brown eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Stanton, he greeted, stepping aside to let her enter. She hesitated. Perhaps we should speak downstairs in the parlor. It would be more appropriate. And more public, Bart pointed out. If what you're about to discuss involves potential wrongdoing by prominent townspeople, private might be better than proper. Lucinda considered this, then nodded and stepped into the room. Bart left the door partially open, a concession to propriety. Please sit, he offered, indicating the room's only chair while he remained standing. She sat primly on the edge of the seat, removing a small leather portfolio from her handbag. My husband was a meticulous record-keeper, Mr. Jericho. Every transaction, every loan, every investment was documented in duplicate. And, Bart prompted when she paused, and according to his personal ledgers, the bank should have considerably more assets than what I've been told remains. Her fingers tightened on the portfolio. When I questioned Mr. Hargrove, who has assumed management of the bank, he suggested that Gerald had been embezzling funds. Bart raised an eyebrow. Did you believe him? My husband was many things, Mr. Jericho, but he was not a thief. The conviction in her voice was unwavering. Gerald worked 16-hour days building that bank from nothing. Everything we had was invested in it. If he was stealing, what did he do with the money? We lived comfortably but modestly. She opened the portfolio, revealing neat columns of figures. 3 weeks before his death, Gerald began acting strangely. He stayed up late, reviewing these ledgers repeatedly. He mentioned concerns about discrepancies but wouldn't elaborate. You think someone else was stealing and your husband discovered it, Bart surmised. Lucinda nodded. And now that same someone is trying to ensure I don't discover the same thing by discrediting Gerald's reputation and intimidating me into accepting whatever settlement they offer. Bart took the portfolio when she offered it, scanning the precise handwriting. The numbers meant little to him, but the organization was impressive. Why me? He asked bluntly. Surely there are others in town better suited to financial matters. I need someone with no connections to San Vicent's business community. Someone who won't be compromised by existing relationships. She met his gaze directly. The station master mentioned you arrived only a month ago. Before that, you worked cattle drives. You keep to yourself. You have no reason to protect anyone here. You've been asking about me. Bart wasn't sure whether to be irritated or impressed by her thoroughness. I make it my business to know who I'm dealing with, Mr. Jericho. And what exactly are you asking me to do, Mrs. Stanton? Help me investigate. Be present during my meetings with the bank trustees. Your reputation precedes you people are less likely to try intimidation tactics with you nearby. She hesitated. And if necessary, help me gather evidence of wrongdoing that I can take to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Bart returned the portfolio. That sounds like the kind of trouble that gets people shot. Yes, she acknowledged simply. It does. He studied her for a long moment. There was no tremor in her voice now, no uncertainty in her posture. This wasn't a frightened widow seeking protection. This was a woman determined to fight for what was hers. $20 a week, he said finally, plus expenses. Relief washed across her face. Agreed, when can you start? I already have. Bart reached for his hat and gun belt. First stop is the bank. I want to see these trustees' faces when you introduce me as your new, what should we call it? Security consultant. For the first time, Lucinda smiled, a small, tight expression, but genuine. I was thinking financial auditor. It sounds more official and should make them appropriately nervous. Mrs. Stanton, Bart said, feeling that unfamiliar twitch at his lips again. I believe this arrangement might work out after all. The San Vicent Bank and Trust stood at the corner of Main Street and Railroad Avenue, its red brick facade and impressive columns designed to inspire confidence in depositors. Bart walked beside Lucinda, matching his longer stride to her measured pace. He'd insisted on wearing his gun belt despite her suggestion that a more businesslike appearance might be appropriate. If we're right about what's happening, he'd told her, I'd rather be armed than presentable. Now, as they climbed the bank's stone steps, Bart noticed the subtle changes in Lucinda's demeanor. Her chin lifted slightly higher, her shoulders squared, and her expression became one of polite determination. It was like watching a soldier prepare for battle. Inside, the bank hummed with mid-morning activity. A few customers stood in line before the teller windows, while a clerk worked diligently at a desk in the corner. All activity seemed to pause momentarily as Lucinda entered, whispers following in her wake. She approached a young man seated at a desk near the bank vault. Good morning, Mr. Ellis. I need to see Mr. Hargrove immediately. Ellis, barely old enough to grow a proper mustache, blinked nervously. I'm afraid Mr. Hargrove is in a meeting, Mrs. Stanton. Interrupt it, she replied calmly. Tell him his presence is required regarding urgent matters of bank oversight. Mr. Jericho and I will wait in his office." Without waiting for a response, Lucinda proceeded toward a door marked Manager at the rear of the building. Bart followed, impressed by her commanding presence despite the curious and sometimes disapproving glances from other customers. Hargrove's office was exactly what Bart expected: expensive furnishings, ornate bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and a massive desk positioned to intimidate anyone seated across from it. Lucinda took one of the visitor chairs without invitation, arranging her skirts with deliberate care. "That's Gerald's desk," she said quietly to Bart. "It was custom-made by a carpenter in Denver as a gift from the original investors when the bank opened." Before Bart could respond, the door opened, and a corpulent man with mutton chop whiskers entered, his face flushed with irritation. "Lucinda, this is highly irregular." Hargrove's tone suggested he was addressing a misbehaving child rather than the widow of his former partner. "I was in a meeting with the Cattlemen's Association regarding a significant loan package. How fortunate, then, that I've come to discuss financial matters as well." Lucinda's voice remained steady. "Victor, this is Mr. Bartholomew Jericho, who will be conducting an independent audit of the bank's accounts on my behalf." Hargrove's face reddened further. "That's absolutely out of the question. As I've explained repeatedly, as a minority shareholder, you have no authority to demand such actions. According to my husband's will, I hold 45% of this bank's shares. Hardly a minority position, Victor." Lucinda opened her portfolio. "Additionally, the shareholder agreement clearly states that any accounting discrepancies must be investigated upon formal request from any shareholder holding more than 20% interest." She removed a document and placed it on the desk. "This is my formal request as stipulated in Section 7, Paragraph 3 of that agreement." Bart watched Hargrove carefully, noting the momentary flicker of panic in the man's eyes before it was replaced by controlled anger. "This is preposterous." Hargrove didn't touch the document. "Your husband's financial improprieties are what created these discrepancies you're so concerned about. Prove it." Bart spoke for the first time, his voice low, and even Hargrove's head snapped toward him. "I beg your pardon. If Gerald Stanton was stealing, there should be evidence. Bank drafts, withdrawal slips, irregular transfers." Bart leaned forward slightly. "Show Mrs. Stanton the proof." "I don't answer to hired thugs," Hargrove spat. "No," Lucinda interjected smoothly, "you answer to bank shareholders and, if necessary, federal banking regulators." "Mr. Jericho begins his examination of the books tomorrow morning. Will require access to all financial records for the past 18 months. This is outrageous. The board will never approve. The board doesn't need to approve what's already permitted in the shareholder agreement," Lucinda cut him off. "Unless, of course, there's something you're trying to hide." The standoff lasted several seconds, with Hargrove's face cycling through various shades of red. Finally, he snatched up the formal request. "Very well. The records will be made available, but Mr. Tanner from our legal department will be present during any examination." "As will I," Lucinda stated firmly. Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "This is a mistake, Lucinda. You're bringing unwanted scrutiny to matters better left settled quietly." "The only mistake," she replied, rising from her chair, "was assuming I would accept your explanation without question." "Good day, Victor. We'll return at 9 tomorrow morning." Outside the bank, Bart noticed Lucinda's hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted her gloves. The confidence she displayed inside seemed to recede now that they were alone. "You did well," he told her. "He's definitely hiding something," she nodded, taking a deep breath. "Did you see his reaction when I mentioned the 18-month time frame? That's when the discrepancies in Gerald's personal records begin." "We'll need to be careful," Bart cautioned. "Men like Hargrove don't give up power or money easily." "No," Lucinda agreed soberly. "My husband's death has taught me that much at least." Bart glanced at her sharply. You think Hargrove had something to do with your husband's death. Pneumonia is a common enough affliction, she said quietly. But Gerald rarely took ill and he declined so quickly. The doctor said it was unusual but not unheard of. You should have mentioned this suspicion earlier, Bart said, his voice hardening. Would you have believed me? Lucinda challenged. Or would you have dismissed me as a grieving widow unable to accept a natural death? Bart had no ready answer for that. They walked in silence for several moments before he spoke again. We should review your husband's ledgers more thoroughly before tomorrow. If Hargrove is involved in embezzlement, he'll have had time to alter the bank's records. I've been comparing figures for weeks, Lucinda said. The differences are subtle but consistent. Money disappearing from certain accounts, unusual transfers to numbered accounts rather than named ones. We need to identify those accounts, Bart mused. Follow the money to whoever's taking it. Yes, Lucinda agreed, then hesitated. Mr. Jericho, there's something else you should know. The night before Gerald fell ill, he told me he'd discovered something troubling about one of the bank's largest depositors. He planned to confront them the next day, but by morning, he was already feverish. Bart absorbed this new information with growing concern. What had started as a straightforward job, intimidate some unscrupulous businessmen into dealing fairly with a widow, was rapidly evolving into something far more dangerous. Mrs. Stanton, if your suspicions about your husband's death have merit, you could be placing yourself in considerable danger. She stopped walking and turned to face him directly. I'm already in danger, Mr. Jericho. The question is whether I face it standing up or lying down. The determination in her eyes reminded him painfully of Thomas. His brother had worn that same expression the morning of his death, insisting they confront the rustlers rather than let them escape with the cattle. We'll need somewhere private to work, Bart said, pushing away the memory. Not your home and not my boarding house. Too many curious ears in both places. Lucinda considered this. Gerald kept a small office behind his workshop. Few people know about it. He enjoyed woodworking as a hobby and converted part of our carriage house for that purpose. That might work. Is it far? Just at the edge of town. We can go there now, if you're amenable. The Stanton residence stood on a tree-lined street of similar well-maintained homes, the respectable side of San Vicente where merchants and professionals lived. The main house was a handsome two-story structure with a wraparound porch and carefully tended flower beds. Behind it stood a carriage house, slightly weathered but solid. Lucinda led Bart through a side door into what had clearly been Gerald Stanton's sanctuary. Woodworking tools hung in precise order on the walls. A half-finished rocking chair sat on a workbench, fine sawdust still clinging to its curves as if waiting for its creator's return. Through here, Lucinda said softly, moving toward the back of the space. A second, smaller room had been partitioned off, containing a modest desk, filing cabinet, and small safe. The walls were lined with bookshelves holding ledgers, banking references, and various legal texts. Gerald called this his thinking room, Lucinda explained, her voice carrying a hint of the grief she normally kept carefully contained. He said sometimes he needed to escape the bank to see things clearly. Bart nodded, understanding the impulse. Sometimes a man needed space away from others' expectations to find the truth of a situation. This will work, he said, examining the room's single window, which could be securely shuttered. We should bring whatever records you have here. I don't want you transporting them daily, too many opportunities for them to disappear. They spent the remainder of the day organizing Gerald's personal records and comparing them against the notes Lucinda had already compiled. Bart wasn't trained in banking or finance, but he'd kept trail drive accounts and could follow the basic principles. By late afternoon, he'd gained a clearer picture of the discrepancies. It's clever, he admitted grudgingly. Small amounts from multiple accounts, never enough to raise alarm from any single depositor. But over time it amounts to nearly $30,000, Lucinda finished. A fortune that's simply vanished, Bart whistled softly. That was more money than most cowboys would see in several lifetimes of hard work. The real question is whether Hargrove is working alone. He tapped the ledger thoughtfully. This level of manipulation would be difficult to hide from other bank employees. Gerald trusted Victor implicitly, Lucinda said, the bitterness evident in her voice. They founded the bank together 10 years ago after both worked for Wells Fargo in Denver. Trust makes for the best betrayal, Bart muttered, more to himself than to her. They worked until the light began to fade, at which point Lucinda lit a lamp and rose to stretch her cramped muscles. You should get some rest before tomorrow, Bart suggested, noting the shadows under her eyes. Hargrove won't make this easy. No, I don't imagine he will, she hesitated. Would you join me for dinner, Mr. Jericho? My housekeeper always prepares more than enough, and we have additional matters to discuss. The invitation surprised him. He'd grown accustomed to taking his meals alone at the saloon or the small cafe near the boarding house. That's not necessary. It wasn't offered out of necessity, she interrupted gently. Consider it appreciation for your assistance today. Bart found himself nodding before he'd fully decided to accept. Thank you, that would be pleasant. The main house was as tastefully appointed inside as its exterior suggested. The dining room featured a polished oak table that could comfortably seat 8, though only 2 places had been set at one end. A gray-haired woman Lucinda introduced as Mrs. Fletcher served a simple but well-prepared meal of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Conversation flowed more easily than Bart had expected. Lucinda was well-read and thoughtful, asking intelligent questions about his experiences without prying into the darker aspects of his past. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Bart found himself engaging in genuine conversation rather than the terse exchanges that usually characterized his interactions. You mentioned cattle drives, Lucinda said as they finished their meal. What brought you to San Vicente? It's hardly on the main trail routes. Bart hesitated, swirling the water in his glass. He deliberately avoided whiskey tonight, needing his wits about him. I was heading north, he answered finally. No particular destination in mind. My horse picked up a stone bruise outside town, so I stopped to let him recover. And decided to rest, he corrected. Staying implies a commitment I haven't made. Lucinda studied him over her teacup. You don't strike me as a man who lacks commitment, Mr. Jericho. Quite the opposite. I committed once, to family, to building something lasting. The words emerged more bitterly than he'd intended. The world had other ideas. The world can be unspeakably cruel, Lucinda agreed softly. That doesn't mean we stop trying to find our place in it. Bart looked up, meeting her gaze. There was understanding there, not pity, a recognition of shared experience rather than sympathy for his circumstances. It caught him off guard. Your husband, he said, changing the subject. What was he like? A small smile touched her lips. Methodical. Principled. He believed banking wasn't just about money but about helping communities grow. Her expression grew thoughtful. He wasn't demonstrative, but he was kind. Our marriage was one of companionship and mutual respect. Not love, the question escaped before Bart could think better of it. If Lucinda was offended, she didn't show it. Love comes in many forms, Mr. Jericho. Ours was quiet but genuine. We were partners in life, if not the passionate characters from the novels my sister sends from Boston. There was something refreshingly honest about her assessment. No romantic embellishment, just straightforward acknowledgement of what had been. I should take my leave, Bart said, rising from the table. Tomorrow will likely be challenging. Lucinda walked him to the door. In the entryway, she hesitated, then asked, Mr. Jericho, may I ask what happened? To make you, she stopped, seemingly reconsidering her words. To make me what, Mrs. Stanton? His voice had cooled considerably. To make you so certain the world deserves your contempt, she finished quietly. Bart's hand tightened on the doorknob. My brother was murdered 2 years ago. I watched him die in my arms while good, decent people stood by and did nothing. Afterward, I hunted down the men responsible and discovered half the town had known who they were all along. I'm sorry, she said simply. Don't be, it was educational. His voice was flat. Taught me that most people will choose comfort over justice every time. That civilization is just a thin veneer over base self-interest. And yet, Lucinda observed, here you are, helping a stranger seek justice. Bart had no ready response to that. He tipped his hat and stepped into the cool evening air, troubled by her perception. He wasn't helping her out of some noble impulse. It was a job, paid work. Nothing more. But as he walked back toward the boarding house, the lie felt hollow even to himself. Morning found Bart outside the bank before it opened, watching employees arrive. He noted which ones entered through the back door, who carried keys, who seemed rushed or nervous. Details mattered in situations like this. Lucinda arrived precisely at 8:45, dressed in a deep blue outfit that, while still respectful of her mourning period, projected authority rather than grief. They exchanged brief greetings before entering the bank together at 9 o'clock. Hargrove was waiting, along with a thin, nervous man introduced as Edgar Tanner, the bank's legal advisor. They were escorted to a small conference room where several ledgers and file boxes had been arranged. These contain the records you requested, Hargrove announced stiffly. Mr. Tanner will remain present during your examination to ensure bank confidentiality is maintained. Of course, Lucinda agreed smoothly. I'm sure Mr. Tanner appreciates that. As Gerald's widow and a major shareholder, I'm already bound by those same confidentiality agreements. Bart took up position near the door, his presence clearly making Tanner uncomfortable. Good. Uncomfortable people made mistakes. For the next several hours, Lucinda methodically compared the bank's official records against the notes she'd prepared from Gerald's personal ledgers. Occasionally, she would ask Tanner to explain certain entries or procedures, her questions precise and increasingly pointed as discrepancies emerged. By midday, the tension in the room was palpable. Tanner had sent for Hargrove twice as Lucinda identified transactions that couldn't be adequately explained. This transfer to account number 447, she said, tapping the ledger. 10 separate withdrawals of $87 each, all on consecutive Fridays. Yet there's no corresponding deposit record. Clerical error, most likely, Tanner suggested weakly. The same clerical error 10 times in succession, Bart asked from his position by the door. That's either remarkable incompetence or remarkable convenience. Mr. Jericho, Hargrove snapped as he re-entered the room, you are here as an observer, not an investigator. Actually, Lucinda corrected, he's here as my appointed representative with full authority to question any aspect of these records. She turned to a new page in the ledger. Now, I'd like to see the account holder information for numbers 447, 829, and 1056. All three show irregular transaction patterns consistent with what my husband identified as potential fraud. Hargrove's face hardened. Those are private accounts. Even as a shareholder, you have no right to individual depositor information without cause. Systematic fund diversion is cause, Victor. Lucinda's voice remained steady, but Bart noticed her hands trembling slightly as she closed the ledger. Either provide the information willingly, or I'll be forced to request a formal investigation from the Territorial Banking Commission. You wouldn't dare, Hargrove hissed. Such an investigation would destroy public confidence in this institution. Your husband's legacy would be ruined. My husband's legacy is truth and integrity, Lucinda replied. If preserving that requires temporary discomfort, so be it. The standoff was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. A young clerk entered, looking apologetic. Excuse me, Mr. Hargrove, but Mr. Peterson is here to see you. He says it's urgent. Bart's attention sharpened at the mention of Peterson, the saloon owner who had threatened Lucinda days earlier. Tell him I'm occupied, Hargrove replied irritably. Sir, he was quite insistent, said it concerns the special arrangement and cannot wait. Something passed between Hargrove and Tanner, a look of alarm quickly masked. Very well, Hargrove conceded. Mr. Tanner, please continue assisting Mrs. Stanton. I'll return shortly. As Hargrove left, Bart made a split-second decision. Mrs. Stanton, I believe I'll step out for some fresh air myself. The room has become rather stuffy. She met his eyes, understanding immediately. Of course, Mr. Jericho, please don't go far. Bart slipped out and followed Hargrove at a discreet distance. The bank manager led Peterson to a small office near the rear of the building, closing the door firmly behind them. Bart positioned himself near an adjacent window, angled to remain unseen while catching fragments of their heated conversation. Can't continue the withdrawals, Hargrove was saying. She's examining everything. Peterson's response was muffled, but his tone was threatening. I'm well aware of our arrangement, Hargrove replied tersely, but circumstances have changed. Her hired man is trouble. He has a reputation. More muffled words from Peterson, then Hargrove's voice again, lower but intense. No, absolutely not. Gerald's death was unfortunate but natural. I won't be party to the conversation. Dropped to whispers then, too quiet for Bart to catch. After several minutes, the door opened and both men emerged. Peterson looked furious while Hargrove appeared shaken. Friday, Peterson said audibly as they parted. Not a day later or we'll have a very different conversation. Bart retreated quickly, returning to the conference room before Hargrove. Lucinda looked up expectantly when he entered. Fresh air agreed with you, I trust. Enlightening, Bart replied cryptically, resuming his position by the door. When Hargrove returned, his composure was restored, though a slight sheen of sweat on his brow betrayed his inner turmoil. Mrs. Stanton, upon reflection, I believe this examination has proceeded far enough for one day. The bank will be closing shortly and these records must be secured overnight. We've barely scratched the surface, Lucinda protested. Nevertheless, Hargrove insisted, we'll need to continue tomorrow. Mr. Tanner has other appointments this afternoon. Bart could see Lucinda weighing her options. Pushing too hard might alert Hargrove to what they'd already discovered. Retreating temporarily could give them time to process what they'd learned. Very well, she conceded, gathering her notes. We'll return tomorrow at 9. I expect those account holder records to be available then, Victor. Outside, they walked several blocks before speaking, mindful of potential observers. What did you learn? Lucinda asked quietly once they were safely away from the bank. Bart recounted the exchange between Hargrove and Peterson. They're definitely working together. Peterson mentioned a Friday deadline, which aligns with those regular withdrawals you identified. And the comment about Gerald's death, Lucinda's voice wavered slightly. Inconclusive, Bart admitted, but Hargrove seemed genuinely disturbed by whatever Peterson was suggesting. They returned to Gerald's workshop, where Bart secured the door behind them before continuing. I believe they've been systematically embezzling from the bank, using numbered accounts to obscure the trail. Peterson likely handles the money once it leaves the bank, laundering it through his saloon, perhaps. But why would Gerald have fallen ill immediately after discovering this? Lucinda pressed. The timing is too convenient. Bart sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. I don't have proof either way, Mrs. Stanton, but based on what I overheard, I think Peterson may be more dangerous than Hargrove. The banker seemed frightened by whatever was being proposed. Lucinda sank into the desk chair, the weight of the situation evident in her posture. What do we do now? They know we're investigating if they're desperate enough. We need those account records, Bart decided. Without them, it's your word against Hargrove's about the discrepancies. He'll never provide them voluntarily. No, Bart agreed, which means we'll need to obtain them by other means. Lucinda looked up sharply. You're suggesting we break into the bank, not the bank, Hargrove's office, tonight. Bart's expression was grim. Those records exist somewhere. My guess is he keeps them separate from the general bank files. That's incredibly dangerous, Lucinda protested. If we're caught, if we don't act quickly, whatever evidence exists might disappear permanently. Bart leaned against the desk. Friday is clearly significant. Today is Wednesday. That gives them 2 days to cover their tracks or worse. The implication hung in the air between them. If Peterson and Hargrove were willing to harm Gerald Stanton, they might not hesitate to eliminate other threats. Lucinda took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "Very well, but I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not," Bart objected immediately. "This isn't a task for a woman." She challenged. "Mr. Jericho, I've spent countless hours in that bank. I know its layout intimately, including which floorboards creak and which windows can be opened silently. More importantly, I can recognize relevant documents at a glance, where you might waste precious time." Her logic was sound, but Bart still hesitated. If something goes wrong, your reputation would be destroyed. Worse, you could face criminal charges. "My husband may have been murdered," Lucinda said quietly. "What matters more, my reputation or justice?" The determination in her eyes reminded him painfully of Thomas again. That same unwavering conviction that right must prevail, regardless of risk. "We'll need to prepare carefully," Bart conceded finally. "And you'll follow my instructions without question once we're inside." "Agreed." "Agreed." They spent the remainder of the afternoon planning. Lucinda drew a detailed layout of the bank, marking entry points, the location of the night watchman's usual route, and where Hargrove kept his most sensitive files. As dusk approached, Bart insisted they pause their preparations. "You should go inside, be seen by your housekeeper having a normal evening meal," he advised. "I'll return later after full dark." Lucinda nodded, visibly nervous but resolute. "The back gate will be unlocked. Come through the garden to avoid being seen from the street." Bart returned to his boarding house room to prepare. He cleaned his revolver meticulously, though he hoped desperately it wouldn't be needed. Violence would only complicate an already dangerous situation. Still, he'd learned the hard way that hope made for poor protection. He also changed into darker clothing, a black shirt and his darkest trousers. Not ideal for complete concealment, but less conspicuous than his usual attire. At 10:30, Bart slipped out of the boarding house and made his way through the quiet streets. San Vicente wasn't large enough to support much nightlife beyond the saloon, and most respectable businesses were closed and dark. The Stanton residence was similarly quiet, though a single lamp burned in what Bart presumed was Lucinda's bedroom. He found the back gate as promised and moved silently through the garden to the rear door. Before he could knock, the door opened, revealing Lucinda dressed in a dark brown skirt and jacket, practical clothing that wouldn't reflect light or make noise. "Mrs. Fletcher?" Bart whispered. "Gone to her sister's for the night, as she does every Wednesday," Lucinda replied quietly. "We're alone." She led him to the workshop, where she'd laid out several items. A small bull's-eye lantern with a shutter to control the light, a ring of skeleton keys that had belonged to Gerald, and a folded black shawl to cover her distinctive auburn hair. "The night watchman makes his rounds every hour," she explained. "He checks the front door and windows, then walks around the building before returning to his chair in the lobby, where he invariably dozes until the next hour." "How do you know his routine so precisely?" A hint of a smile touched her lips. "Gerald often worked late. He complained about having to wake poor Mr. Dunnigan whenever he wanted to leave after hours." They waited until nearly midnight before setting out, taking a circuitous route to avoid the main streets where the town marshal might be patrolling. The bank stood dark and imposing against the night sky, its windows like vacant eyes watching their approach. Lucinda led them to a side entrance, a small door used primarily by cleaning staff and maintenance workers. Gerald's keys granted them access with minimal noise, and they slipped inside, freezing momentarily to listen for any sign of the night watchman. Hearing nothing, they proceeded carefully through the darkened corridors. Lucinda moved with surprising stealth, placing her feet exactly where the floorboards were least likely to creak. Bart followed her lead, impressed by her competence under pressure. They reached Hargrove's office without incident. The door was locked, but again, Gerald's keys proved their worth. Inside, Bart allowed himself a small sigh of relief before addressing the task at hand. Where would he keep private records? He whispered. Lucinda pointed to an ornate cabinet behind the desk. There. It has a false back panel. Gerald had one made similarly. Working quickly but methodically, they located the hidden compartment and extracted several slim folders. Lucinda's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the first one, holding it close to the shuttered lantern. "This is it," she breathed. "Account 447 belongs to Peterson himself, and look regular deposits matching exactly the amounts missing from the general ledger." They found similar records for the other suspicious accounts, along with a coded ledger that, with Lucinda's banking knowledge, they quickly determined tracked the full scope of the embezzlement. "Nearly $40,000, Lucinda murmured, shocked. "Far more than I'd estimated." "Enough to kill for," Bart observed grimly. He was about to suggest they take what they'd found and leave when a noise from the outer bank froze them in place, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Bart immediately extinguished the lantern, plunging them into darkness. He moved to the office door, listening intently as footsteps crossed the lobby. "It's not the watchman," he whispered. "Too purposeful." The footsteps continued toward the offices. Bart made a split-second decision, drawing his revolver and guiding Lucinda behind the desk. "Stay down," he ordered quietly. "If something happens, take these records and run. Don't look back, don't hesitate." The doorknob turned slowly. Bart raised his weapon, positioning himself to shield Lucinda. The door opened, revealing a silhouette Bart recognized immediately: Peterson, holding a lantern in one hand and what appeared to be a small box in the other. Well, Peterson drawled, unsurprised. "Hargrove said you might try something like this." "Step back, Peterson," Bart commanded, his voice deadly calm. "We're leaving with these records." Peterson chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. "I don't think so, Jericho. This ends tonight." "Where's Hargrove?" Bart demanded, trying to assess if others were present. "Getting himself conveniently alibied at a card game across town." Peterson set his lantern on a nearby table, the light casting grotesque shadows across his face. "He lacks the stomach for necessary unpleasantness. Like murdering Gerald Stanton." Lucinda's voice came from behind the desk, steady despite the circumstances. Peterson's expression hardened. "Stanton got greedy, started asking questions, threatening to expose our arrangement. We had a good system skimming just enough that no one would notice, keeping the territorial inspectors well paid to look the other way." "So you poisoned him," Lucinda accused, rising slowly to stand beside Bart. "A simple additive to his evening tea," Peterson confirmed callously. "Untraceable, induces symptoms identical to pneumonia. Quite effective." Bart's finger tightened on the trigger, rage surging through him at the man's casual admission of murder. "You're going to hang for this, Peterson." "I think not." Peterson raised the small box he carried. "See, that's the beauty of tonight. 2 intruders caught breaking into the bank, killed by the night watchman who heroically intervened. Tragic, but it explains why Mrs. Stanton had been making wild accusations about missing money." "Where is Dunnigan?" Bart demanded. Peterson's smile was chilling. "Taking a permanent nap in the supply closet. Laudanum in his coffee. He'll wake with no memory of tonight, perfect for my version of events." Bart assessed their options rapidly. Peterson stood between them and the door. Even if he shot the man, the noise would likely attract attention. They needed those records to prove the embezzlement and murder. "The money," Bart said, stalling for time. "What was the plan? 40,000 is too much to spend in San Vicente without raising questions." "Friday's stage carries the last shipment east," Peterson revealed, seemingly enjoying the chance to boast. "New lives waiting for us in Chicago. Hargrove handling investments, me opening an establishment catering to more refined clientele than this dusty backwater provides." As he spoke, Bart noticed Lucinda slowly sliding one of the folders into her sleeve. Good she was thinking clearly despite the danger. "You won't make it to Chicago," Bart stated flatly. Peterson laughed. "Your confidence is misplaced, Jericho." Even now, the night watchman from the mercantile is headed this way for his usual check with Dunnigan when he finds the bank being robbed. He patted his jacket pocket meaningfully. I'm always armed for such eventualities. The standoff held for several tense seconds, each calculating their next move. Then, unexpectedly, Lucinda knocked over the lantern on Hargrove's desk. Darkness engulfed them as glass shattered and oil spread across the floor. Bart reacted instinctively, lunging toward Peterson as the man cursed and fumbled for his weapon. They collided violently, Bart's momentum carrying them both into the wall. Peterson was stocky and strong, landing a solid punch to Bart's ribs that nearly caused him to drop his revolver. "Run." Bart shouted to Lucinda, grappling with Peterson in the darkness. He heard her footsteps heading for the door but couldn't see if she'd escaped. Peterson used the distraction to break Bart's grip, shoving him backward over a chair. Both men crashed to the floor, Peterson's hands finding Bart's throat. Gasping for air, Bart brought his knee up sharply, connecting with Peterson's midsection. The man's grip loosened momentarily enough for Bart to twist sideways and slam the butt of his revolver against Peterson's temple. Peterson slumped, dazed but not unconscious. Bart scrambled to his feet, kicking Peterson's gun away before hauling him upright and slamming him against the wall. "You killed a good man," Bart growled, pressing his revolver under Peterson's chin. "Give me one reason not to return the favor." "Jericho, don't," Lucinda's voice cut through the darkness. She had returned with her lantern, now relit, casting a warm glow across the scene. "He deserves to hang," she continued, her voice steady. "Publicly after everyone knows what he did. That's justice, not this." Bart's hand trembled, his finger tight on the trigger. It would be so easy. Peterson had admitted to murder, had planned to kill them both. The world would be better without him, but something in Lucinda's expression gave him pause. Not judgment or fear, but a quiet conviction that there was a right way to end this, and this wasn't it. Slowly, Bart lowered his gun, though he maintained his grip on Peterson's collar. "Tie his hands," he instructed Lucinda. "We're taking him to the marshal." She quickly found cord in Hargrove's desk and secured Peterson's wrists behind his back. The man had regained his senses enough to start threatening them. "You're making a mistake," he snarled. "Hargrove will deny everything. It'll be your word against ours." "Not quite," Lucinda replied calmly, holding up the folders they'd discovered. "These records are quite detailed, Mr. Peterson. Names, dates, amounts. And I suspect the territorial banking inspector will be very interested in which of his colleagues have been accepting bribes." Peterson's face paled as he realized the extent of the evidence against him. They marched Peterson through the darkened bank, pausing only to check on Dunnigan, who was, as Peterson had said, deeply unconscious but breathing steadily in the supply closet. Outside, the night air felt cleansing after the tension of the confrontation. Bart kept his revolver pressed against Peterson's back as they made their way toward the marshal's office. "What about Hargrove?" Lucinda asked quietly. "Once Peterson starts talking to save his own neck, Hargrove won't get far," Bart assured her. The town marshal, awakened from sleep, was initially skeptical of their story until Lucinda presented the evidence they'd gathered. Peterson, seeing his position deteriorating rapidly, began offering to testify against Hargrove in exchange for leniency. By dawn, both Peterson and Hargrove were behind bars, and telegrams had been sent to the territorial capital requesting federal investigators. The marshal had taken Lucinda's statement officially, treating her with newfound respect as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Bart stood outside the marshal's office as the first light of day touched San Vicente. His hands were shaking again, not from fear or whiskey withdrawal this time, but from the aftermath of contained rage and the knowledge of how close he'd come to pulling that trigger. He flexed his fingers repeatedly, trying to still the trembling. It had been so long since he'd chosen mercy over vengeance that the feeling was almost foreign to him. "Mr. Jericho," Lucinda approached, looking exhausted but resolute. She had given her statement and turned over the evidence, maintaining remarkable composure throughout the process. Mrs. Stanton, he acknowledged, the marshal seems satisfied with your account. Yes, he's sending for the territorial prosecutor. She glanced at his hands, still trembling slightly. Are you injured? Bart tucked his hands into his pockets. No, just aftermath. She nodded, understanding without requiring explanation. Would you walk with me? I find I need fresh air after everything. They walked in companionable silence through the awakening town. Early risers were opening shops, a milk wagon made its rounds, and life continued its ordinary rhythm, oblivious to the night's dramatic events. What will you do now? Bart finally asked as they approached her home. Rebuild, Lucinda replied simply. The bank will need new management. The board has already suggested I might assume Gerald's position, at least temporarily. Bart raised an eyebrow, impressed. They'll accept a woman in that role. They'll accept someone who uncovered fraud that could have destroyed them all, she corrected with a small smile. Gender becomes less important when $40,000 and public reputation are at stake. They reached her garden gate, pausing in the early morning light. Bart realized with some surprise that his hands had stopped shaking. And you, Mr. Jericho, will you continue north as planned? The question caught him off guard. He'd been so focused on Lucinda's predicament that he hadn't considered his own next steps. I haven't decided, he admitted. There's nothing particular calling me elsewhere. Lucinda studied him for a moment. Last night, when you had Peterson at your mercy, you chose restraint over revenge. That suggests a man who hasn't entirely given up on the world, despite his claims to the contrary. Bart looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. One decent choice doesn't erase 2 years of bitterness, Mrs. Stanton. No, she agreed softly, but it's a beginning. Without thinking, Bart removed his hat, a gesture of respect he'd almost forgotten. You've shown considerable courage throughout this ordeal. Your husband would be proud. Thank you, her voice caught slightly. Though I confess, there were moments last night when courage failed me entirely. When Peterson appeared in that doorway. Her hands trembled at the memory, much as Bart's had trembled earlier. Acting on instinct rather than thought, he reached out and took her shaking hands in his. The contact was startling to them, both intimate in a way that transcended propriety. Her hands were smaller than his, smooth against his calloused palms, but there was strength in them too. The trembling gradually subsided as they stood connected in the quiet morning. You didn't run, Bart said finally, his voice low. When it mattered most, you stayed. That's what courage is, not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Lucinda looked up at him, her brown eyes searching his face. Is that what you did after your brother died? Act despite your fear? No, Bart admitted. I acted because of it. I let fear harden into hate until there was nothing else left. And now, the question hung between them, weighted with possibilities neither had considered before last night. Bart realized he was still holding her hands and gently released them, though something in him resisted the separation. Now. He paused, searching for words to express the subtle shift he felt within himself. Now I'm not certain hate is sustainable or desirable. A small smile touched Lucinda's lips. That sounds remarkably like hope, Mr. Jericho. Perhaps, he conceded. A very small amount, barely noticeable. Even small amounts can grow given proper care. She hesitated, then added, the bank will need security during the reorganization. Someone trustworthy to oversee operations until everything is settled. It would be a respectable position with appropriate compensation. The offer surprised him. You're suggesting I stay in San Vicente? I'm suggesting you consider it, Lucinda clarified. The choice, as always, remains yours. Bart replaced his hat, using the motion to collect his thoughts. Part of him urged caution. Attachment meant vulnerability, and he'd sworn never to be vulnerable again after Thomas. Yet something about Lucinda Stanton made him question that resolution. I'll think on it, he promised. That's all I ask. She opened her garden gate. Good day, Mr. Jericho. Bartholomew, he corrected suddenly. Or Bart, if you prefer." Her smile widened slightly. "Bart, then, and I'm Lucinda." "Good day, Lucinda." As she disappeared into her house, Bart stood for a moment longer, examining the unfamiliar sensation in his chest. It wasn't happiness exactly, that emotion seemed too distant still. But it was lighter than anything he'd felt in years. A lessening of the burden he'd carried since Thomas died. Over the next few weeks, San Vicente experienced a flurry of activity surrounding the bank scandal. Federal investigators arrived, combing through records and taking statements. Peterson and Hargrove were transferred to Cheyenne to await trial, their guilt seemingly assured given the extensive evidence. Bart found himself accepting Lucinda's offer of employment, telling himself it was merely practical good pay for straightforward work. But honesty forced him to acknowledge other motivations. He found himself looking forward to their daily meetings, appreciating her sharp mind and quiet determination. For her part, Lucinda demonstrated remarkable aptitude for banking operations. The board had indeed appointed her interim manager, and under her guidance, the bank began rebuilding trust with the community. She worked long hours, mastering details Gerald had handled previously, never complaining about the skepticism some customers initially displayed toward a woman in her position. Their professional relationship gradually expanded to include occasional shared meals or evening walks. Conversations ranged from bank business to books they'd read, childhood memories to hopes for San Vicente's future. Bart found himself speaking of Thomas more freely than he had with anyone, sharing stories of their youth rather than just the tragedy of his death. 6 months after the night they'd confronted Peterson, Bart stood outside the bank at closing time, waiting as Lucinda completed her final tasks for the day. The autumn air carried a crispness that hinted at the coming winter, but the sunshine remained warm on his face. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Lucinda said as she emerged, locking the door behind her. "No trouble," Bart assured her, offering his arm. It was a gesture that had become natural between them, one of many small courtesies that had gradually replaced the formal distance of their early acquaintance. They walked toward her home as they often did, discussing the day's events. The territorial court had sentenced Peterson to hanging for Gerald's murder, while Hargrove had received 20 years for his role in the embezzlement and conspiracy. The final restitution payments were processed today, Lucinda mentioned as they turned onto her street. "Every account has been restored to its proper balance." "That's quite an achievement," Bart acknowledged. "Most banks wouldn't have survived such a scandal." "Most banks don't have depositors who have known the manager since childhood," she replied with a small smile. "There are advantages to small communities, despite their flaws." Bart nodded, thinking of how San Vicente had slowly become more than just a temporary stop for him. He'd rented a small house near the town center, acquired a few pieces of furniture, even planted some vegetables in the modest backyard. Small acts of permanence he hadn't allowed himself in years. "The board offered me the manager position permanently today," Lucinda said as they reached her garden. "No more interim qualification." "That's excellent news," Bart responded, genuinely pleased for her. They'd be fools to choose anyone else. They also mentioned they're quite satisfied with current security arrangements. Her eyes held a hint of mischief. "In fact, they suggested making your position permanent as well." Bart considered this as they entered her garden, following the path to the porch where they often sat in the evenings. The boards had been freshly painted, one of many small improvements Lucinda had made to the property recently. "Permanent," he repeated, testing the word. Once it would have sent him reaching for his saddlebags, ready to move on before attachments formed. Now, surprisingly, it felt right. They sat on the porch swing, another recent addition that Bart himself had helped install. The gentle rocking motion had become comforting to them both. "I've been thinking about Gerald's workshop," Lucinda said after a comfortable silence. "It seems a shame to leave it empty." Bart glanced toward the carriage house. "You're considering selling his tools?" "No," she corrected. I'm considering finding someone who might use them. Someone with capable hands who appreciates craftsmanship. She looked pointedly at Bart's hands, resting on his knees. They had stopped shaking months ago, finding purpose in honest work rather than violence or whiskey. I know little about woodworking, he admitted. Gerald kept detailed notes and drawings. He was a patient teacher. His journals could be yours. She hesitated, then added more softly, "The house is too large for just me, you know. The east wing has its own entrance, practically a separate residence." Bart turned to study her face, recognizing the invitation beneath her words. They had been circling this moment for weeks, perhaps months, the acknowledgement that their relationship had grown beyond friendship or professional cooperation. "Lucinda," he began carefully, "people would talk. A widow and a man living on the same property, even with separate entrances." "People always talk," she replied with surprising unconcern. "They talked when I took over the bank. They talked when you stayed in San Vicente. Their opinions matter far less to me than my own peace." She reached over and took his hand, a deliberate echo of that morning 6 months ago when he had steadied her trembling fingers. "When Gerald died, I thought my life had reached its conclusion not physically, but in terms of purpose and companionship," she continued. "I never expected to find either again, certainly not with a man who claimed to hate the world." Bart's throat tightened with emotion he'd nearly forgotten how to express. "I was lost when I arrived here, drifting without direction or hope. And now?" She asked, just as she had that morning in her garden. This time, Bart had a clearer answer. "Now I find myself thinking about tomorrow with anticipation rather than dread, finding purpose beyond survival." He turned his hand to clasp hers more firmly. "Much of that change is because of you." "Not because of me," Lucinda corrected gently. "Because of what you allowed yourself to rediscover: compassion, justice, connection. Those were always within you, Bart. They were just buried beneath grief." The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, gilding everything in warm, golden light. Bart was struck by how beautiful Lucinda looked in that moment, not just physically, but with the inner strength that had first drawn him to her. "I'm not the man I was before Thomas died," he said quietly. "That Bartholomew Jericho is gone forever. But perhaps the man I've become isn't entirely without merit." "He has considerable merit," Lucinda assured him, her voice warm. "Enough that I find myself hoping he might consider a more permanent arrangement than separate wings of the same house." Bart's eyes widened slightly. "Lucinda, are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that life offers second chances rarely enough that recognizing them is crucial." Her gaze was steady, certain. "I respected Gerald deeply and mourned him sincerely, but what I feel for you is different, not greater or lesser, simply different. A connection I never expected to find at this stage of life." Bart's heart hammered in his chest. The idea of allowing himself to love again, to be that vulnerable, had seemed impossible for so long. Yet sitting here with Lucinda, their hands intertwined, he couldn't imagine returning to solitude. "I haven't courted a woman properly since I was 20 years old," he admitted. "I'm not certain I remember how." A smile touched Lucinda's lips. "Perhaps we could determine our own definition of properly. We're neither of us young romantics, after all." "No," Bart agreed, "but that doesn't mean romance is entirely beyond us." Acting on impulse, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss on her lips there first. It was brief but carried a promise of depth to come, of feelings too complex for hasty expression. When he drew back, Lucinda's eyes remained closed for a moment longer, a slight flush coloring her cheeks. "Well," she said softly as her eyes opened, "that seems a promising beginning to our definition." Bart smiled, a full, genuine smile that felt like coming home after a long absence. "I think so too." The months that followed brought changes both subtle and profound. Bart moved into the east wing of Lucinda's home, though they maintained separate households for propriety's sake. He began learning woodworking from Gerald's journals, discovering an unexpected satisfaction in creating rather than destroying. Their courtship progressed at a measured pace. neither rushing nor delaying the natural deepening of their connection. They attended church together on Sundays, shared meals most evenings, and gradually integrated their lives in ways that felt right rather than prescribed by convention. San Vicente adjusted to seeing them together, initial whispers giving way to acceptance. Lucinda's capable management of the bank earned respect that overshadowed gossip, while Bart's transformation from taciturn drifter to respected security manager and craftsman silenced most critics. On a crisp spring morning, exactly 1 year after their confrontation with Peterson, Bart found Lucinda in Gerald's workshop, now increasingly considered his domain. She was examining a rocking chair he'd completed the previous evening, running her fingers appreciatively over the smooth curves and joints. "It's beautiful," she said as he entered. "You've developed a remarkable skill." "I had good guidance," Bart acknowledged, thinking of the detailed notes Gerald had left behind. He'd come to respect the man he'd never met, understanding now what Lucinda had valued in him. "I have something for you," Bart continued, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, hand-carved with an intricate pattern of intertwined vines. Lucinda accepted it with curious eyes. "What's the occasion?" "1 year of new beginnings," Bart replied. "Open it." Inside, nestled on a cushion of deep blue velvet, lay a ring, a simple gold band with a modest diamond flanked by 2 small sapphires. Lucinda's breath caught. She looked up at Bart, her eyes bright with emotion. "I've been thinking about permanence," he said quietly. "About choosing a path forward together, openly and honestly, if you're willing." "Are you certain?" Lucinda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marriage is a significant commitment for a man who once planned to keep traveling north." Bart took her free hand, the one not holding the ring box. His fingers were steady and warm against hers. "I've never been more certain of anything," he assured her. The traveling man was searching for something he couldn't name. "I don't need to search anymore. I've found what matters here with you." Tears welled in Lucinda's eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Then yes. Yes, I will marry you, Bartholomew Jericho." The wedding took place in June, a modest ceremony attended by the friends they'd made in San Vicente. Afterward, they stood greeting well-wishers on the church steps, Lucinda resplendent in a gown of deep blue rather than traditional white, a choice that acknowledged her past while celebrating her future. "Mrs. Jericho," Bart said later that evening as they sat on their porch, swing now truly theirs together. "How does it sound to you?" "Like a new chapter," Lucinda replied, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "For both of us." Bart's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her closer. His hands, once perpetually shaking from grief and rage and whiskey, were now steady with purpose and peace. The bitterness that had defined him for so long had gradually given way to something he'd thought forever beyond his reach: contentment. "When I first arrived in San Vicente," he mused, "I believed the world held nothing worth investing in, nothing worth the risk of caring." "And now?" Lucinda asked, echoing the question that had marked pivotal moments in their relationship. Bart gazed out at the garden they'd expanded together, then back at the woman who had helped him rediscover his capacity for connection. "Now I understand that the world is neither wholly good nor wholly evil," he answered thoughtfully. "It simply is. The meaning comes from what we choose to build within it." Lucinda reached for his hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become natural between them. "And what are we building, Bart?" He smiled, thinking of all they had already created together and all that still lay ahead: the bank thriving under her guidance, the furniture taking shape under his hands, the home they were making, the lives they were joining. "Something lasting," he replied, certainty warming his voice. "Something true." As twilight deepened around them, Bart Jericho held his wife's hand and felt the final fragments of his hatred for the world dissolve into gratitude for the grace he'd found when he least expected it, when a widow's trembling hands had steadied his own, and in doing so, had shown him a way back to life.